So it's mountain bike season here in the US, and across the nation, NICA teams are getting ready for their season. Parents are bringing their kids to those first mountain bike practices, and the coaches are checking the bikes. That was my experience actually this last week. As a new coach to our local mountain bike team, I was helping check bikes. And I thought this is probably stuff that a lot of you guys would want to know also. So I'm gonna share with you a lot of the things that I went over with the kids on their bikes to make sure that they were ready to ride for the season. So let's get into it. First on the list was the frame. So looking at the frame, I was looking for anything that indicated that the bike itself, the frame of the bike itself, warranted a replacement. We were looking at good, worn out, or needs to be replaced. And so you're looking for places where perhaps there's cracks, dents, dings that could be a problem throughout the season or could cause an issue or an accident during the ride. So you're looking at really stress points on the headset. If you've got suspension on different parts on the linkages, making sure that everything's the way it should be, that there's not an indication that the wear would cause a problem. Most kids, the frames were just fine. Number two is the fork. You want to make sure the fork is in good repair also, that there's no damage that is an issue. If you've got dropouts, that there's no issues with the dropouts working correctly, that they weren't damaged either when the wheel was off. Whatever it might be, you're looking for damage on the fork. And then also you want to make sure that it's functioning correctly. If it's a suspension fork, which I hope for kids racing NICA that they're going to have a suspension fork, you want to make sure that the suspension is working correctly. If it has lockouts, adjustments, check those to make sure that they're in place, that they're not loose, that they're working correctly. If your fork warrants a rebuild or needs new oil, or maybe it needs to be topped off on air, is the air setting correctly? Is the fork working correctly? Is it set correctly for your weight? These are the things you want to look for. When you're doing a NICA check like I was, we didn't want to fix everyone's bikes, but we were listing if it needed to be looked at by a shop, we'd recommend that. Number three on the list is the rear shock. You want to make sure, similar to the front shock, that it's working correctly. Really check those pivots, make sure the pivots are moving correctly, that the shock moves. If it's an air shock, you want to make sure it's set correctly to the rider. And if it's a coil shock, you want to make sure that it's all working correctly. So it's basically a soft check over the rear shock to make sure it is performing correctly and if it needs to be serviced by a shop. Next up are the brake rotors. And on this, I'm looking for wear on the rotor surface where the brake pads touch it to see if it's worn down, if you're starting to get any kind of ridges from wearing down the pad. And then also, I'm spinning it in the brake to look and see if there's any wobble or play or bends or kinks that have happened since it was rode last in the rotor itself. You can straighten the rotors if you need to with a rotor truing tool, or perhaps it's time for a replacement because of wear. Now, of course, if the bike doesn't have discs, it's running rim brakes of some sort. And we'll talk about that a little bit separately. But the next one on the list then is to check the calipers themselves and the pads. So what I like to look for then is one, that the calipers are attached, secured correctly, that they're not rubbing on the disc. That's an adjustment issue. But then you also want to look down then inside and inspect the pads themselves. And depending on the brakes that you have, you can either see them from the top or perhaps from the bottom on the side, but to see that there's enough pad on there that they don't need to be replaced. Now, similarly, if you're using rim brakes, you're also making sure they're secured correctly, that they're spaced well and adjusted correctly. I'm not going over the adjustments, just the things we're checking. Make sure that the pads also aren't worn, that they're adjusted correctly, and that the brakes themselves are working in good working condition, that they're ready for a ride. So 6, 7, and 8 are to do with the wheels. Number 6 is the hubs. we want to make sure the hubs are in good repair, that quick releases or through axles are attached correctly, that they're set in correctly into the fork or into the rear dropouts. I like to check and see if there's any play side to side that may indicate that the bearings on the hub itself need to be tightened and adjusted to make it so there's not play. We don't want slop in there. The next is to check, number 7, the spokes. I like to just do a quick finger check, make sure things are tight, but not too tight, that they're matched well, and that there's no broken spokes or loose spokes. Once you've checked all of those, you can do kind of a quick true check then on the rim, which is number 8, to make sure it's true and that it's spinning correctly and it doesn't look like there's any dings, dents, or cracks in the rims themselves. We don't want the rims to fail on a ride, which I've had happen before. In addition, on the rims, when you're working with a bike that has rim brakes, you want to make sure that there isn't significant wear on the rims. Sometimes rocks and dents and cracks and stuff can form on the rims, and since this is your braking surface for rim brakes, you want to make sure that these are clear, that they're well maintained, and that you don't have issues that could cause problems with braking in the future. Number 9 is your tires. Still hanging out on the wheel. What we're looking for on this is any wear that could cause issues. When I was doing the bike checks this last week, we live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of goat heads, and I think there wasn't a single bike that didn't have goat head thorns stuck in it. So we want to check, make sure that there's no issues with the tires themselves. If the tires are looking worn, especially on that rear, if there's spots where it's been skidded or worn down to where you don't have as much tread, recommend replacement. You want to check the sidewalls also, and it's a good chance also to check and make sure that the tires are mounted correctly, especially on tubeless wheels. If the tire hasn't set correctly into the rim, sometimes you can have parts of the tire that aren't fully engaged into the edge of the rim, and it causes wobbles and inefficiencies and would probably cause issues with leaking. But you want to check the sidewalls, make sure that they're all good, make sure that there's not issues that could cause a problem or a premature failure on a ride. Number 10 are the brake levers. You want to make sure the brake levers are in good repair, that there's nothing loose that shouldn't be. You want to make sure that it's set up correctly. With a lot of the youth that I was checking their bikes, they had their brake levers all the way to their grips, which is fine for some. We're teaching the youth to make sure that they're using one finger when possible to brake. And if your brakes are all the way in, it gets in the way of your hand position. So you want to make sure that it's set up in a way that's comfortable. Sit on the bike or have them sit on the bike and make sure that it's adjusted correctly for them. If you have hydraulic brakes, you want to make sure that the brakes don't need to be bled. If you've got mechanical brakes, like these that are for V-brakes, you want to make sure that the tension is set correctly, that the brakes are working correctly, that the barrel adjusters are adjusted to set the braking just right for the person's preference and hand position also. Number 11 on the list are the shift levers. And on this one, again, checking to see that everything's tight, that there isn't anything moving. I had a few bikes that actually, they were loose, and so when you would shift, there was play and slop in them. You want to make sure that they're adjusted correctly, that things work. And most important, I had several older bikes that were part of the bike check, some that showed issues when shifting, in that they either were slow to shift or the levers didn't spring back. And this indicates that the mechanism inside the shifter is perhaps gummed up a bit. And this can be dealt with fairly easily with just a little bit of WD-40 and maybe an air compressor to blow it out. I actually had a few where just putting a little bit of WD-40 and then cleaning it up made it so they shifted like brand new again instead of gummed up and slow. Number 12 is the grips. And on checking grips, You can tell really easily when they're worn, when they're getting old. You want to check a couple things. One, you don't want your grips to be moving when you're riding. So if you can move them just standing here, you need to do something about either switching the grips or doing something to tighten them. So you want to make sure the grips are not moving. Lock-on grips make that really easy. They slide on, they're easy to bolt down, and then they stay put. With slide-on grips, you could use things like hairspray or isopropyl alcohol to slide them on or off, or like I like to use just my air compressor to put them on and off. You want them in such a way that they're tight. Once they start to get worn out, they will start to slide more and more, so they need to be replaced. You need to also check that they're capped on the ends. Now, if you've got grips that cover the ends themselves, have a built-in cap, that keeps, it's a safety concern. You don't want that open ring when you fall to gouge you. It makes it much more painful, and it's much better to have either a stopper in the end. If you've got slide-on grips that have rubber on the end, like a lot of the Ori grips that I use, that's why I put a nickel inside. It works as a bar cap inside the grip and keeps that safe also. So you're checking for wear and tear, making sure that they don't move and that they're capped well on the ends. 13 and 14 are the handlebar and the stem. So you want to make sure the handlebar is positioned correctly, that the stem is tightened down on it correctly, and that there's no play, that it's set in a position that's comfortable for the rider, and that things are torqued down to the spec. A lot of stems actually list the specification for clamping down on the handlebars. Number 15 is then the headset. The headset are the bearings that are on the top and the bottom of the forks steer tube. So this is the head tube of the bike right here, and the bearings at the top and the bottom are preloaded on threadless headsets by this top cap right here. So in setting it up, you want to make sure that the top cap has been set correctly, and then the stem is clamped on to hold it. You should be able to, after setting it up, remove the top cap and it shouldn't be a problem, but I recommend leaving it on. But to check the headset once it's installed, to make sure that the preload on the bearings is set correctly. If you turn it side to side and it feels grindy or chunky, like it's kind of jittering through or feels like sand, it may be that you've compressed it too far and it's putting pressure on those bearings, or perhaps the bearings are worn out and need to be replaced. If you loosen it up and it's too loose and you put your bike sideways like this and you wobble it back and forth, you can feel while braking the front wheel, you could feel, if you feel slop back and forth here, where it's moving back and forth, then perhaps you don't have it tight enough. So there's a sweet spot in there for the headset to get it just right so that there's not too much preload set on the bearings themselves, but that there's also no play in the bearings side to side when you hold it like this. If you do a drop check on your bike and you hear rattling up front, that could be another indication that it's not tight enough. 16, 17, and 18 are the seat or saddle, seat post, and seat post clamp. You want to make sure that the seat is placed on the top of the seat post in a way that doesn't go beyond the limits that are set on the seat rails. You want to make sure that it's clamped down at a height that's comfortable for the rider. I personally like a level seat in most instances, depending on how the saddle itself is. And then the seat post, you want to make sure it's set to the right height for the rider, for you or for the rider. And the seat post clamp, you want to make sure that it's clamped down tight according to spec, and that there's no play back and forth, and that it's good and solid. The last thing you want when you're riding is for your seat to slowly inch its way down or to be able to turn side to side. Now, if you're running a dropper seat post, aside from checking those things that we just talked about, you want to make sure that it is working correctly, that it's returning. This one's being a little slow on the return. That it's returning. If it's returning slowly, like this, it may indicate that there's not enough air. So if you need to, you may need to top off the air in your dropper post to make sure that it has enough air pressure to do the full return. But you want to make sure that it's working correctly, that you're not, that you don't have wear or grime, that it's lubed well, and that everything's working and it's not going to cause issues on the ride. Number 19 is your bottom bracket. Your bottom bracket are the bearings at the very bottom that are in between your crank arms. Now these bearings can either be internal or external like they are here. On a lot of newer bikes, the bottom bracket is, the bearings are external. And you want to make sure that they're tightened down correctly. If they're internal, that they're tightened inside the cups correctly, and that there isn't play side to side when you take the cranks like this. Now, if you're feeling grinding of any ways and you can adjust them, you can try that, but they may need to be replaced if the bearings are feeling grindy or sandy at all. Number 20 and 21 are the cranks and the crankset. So continuing on from checking the bottom bracket, you want to, some of the issues that you might have felt with the bottom bracket may have been because the cranks were not tightened on correctly. According to the style of cranks that you have, you want to make sure that they're tightened on correctly. You want to make sure that chain rings, that on chain rings, they almost always have chainring bolts that can loosen over time. You want to make sure that they're not loose, that the chain rings, this is a 3x crankset. You want to make sure that none of these chain rings are loose and could cause issues on a ride. Sometimes the chainring bolts will loosen up and may need to be tightened. But you want to make sure also that there's no excessive wear on the chain rings. If when you're pedaling backwards, the chain kind of sucks and stays attached to a chain ring, it may be first that it's dirty. If it's not and it's cleaned off, it may be that the chain ring has worn in such a way from regular use that the chain itself is sticking to the chain ring. So that might warrant a replacement. But you want to make sure that it pedals correctly. You can do that either forward, backwards. Make sure that it's good, clean, that the chainring bolts are tightened correctly, and that the cranks themselves on the bottom bracket are attached and tightened in such a way that they're not going to come off, that they're set correctly and not causing any play side to side, or that they're causing stress on the bearings. Number 22 on the list is the chain. So at the beginning of the season, maybe you need to clean your chain up. Once it's cleaned, you could also check, most of you don't have one of these, but this is what I use to check my chain. It's a chain checker, and it shows you whether it's okay at 0.5%, 0.75%, and then maybe you need to be replaced. As chains wear out, the pins themselves wear inside and will slowly get a little floppier, that allow the links in the chain to spread out. And as they spread out, or stretch is what some people call it, this chain checker will check that distance over, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So 14 links. And it'll show you whether or not the wear, whether it's stretched a little bit. Now you might want to also check and make sure that as you pedal, if it's rusty, if it's dirty, it'll cause these links to not move correctly. If it's really bone dry and needs to be lubed, that'll also cause the chain to not turn as well and will cause resistance and issues. So you want to make sure it's cleaned and that there's no rust, and then it's lubed correctly and functioning good. And make sure it hasn't stretched. Number 22, pedals. You want to make sure the pedals are attached correctly. A couple weeks back I did a tutorial. One of the tips I had was on removing and installing pedals, but make sure that the pedals are not loose, that you can't like unscrew them with your hand, that would be a problem, that they're good and tight, that they spin freely, and that there's no play with inside the pedals. It may indicate that there's an issue with the bearings, or it's not tightened on, or it's worn out. Now, if you're riding flat pedals like this with the NICA kids, I really recommend getting something, most of them are not wearing clipless pedals, but that they have a pedal that's a good size for their foot. And these pins on modern mountain bike pedals really help with grip and control on their bikes if they're not riding clipless. So you want to make sure that those are good. Some of these can be replaced on different pedals. This pedal itself is replaceable pins if you need to, but you want to make sure that the pedal is in a good repair, it's functioning correctly, and doesn't need to be replaced. Now, if you're riding clipless pedals, there's a few more things to check also. You want to make sure that they haven't been damaged in a way that makes it so the clips themselves won't be able to attach, that it's not worn so that they'll prematurely release either. So you want to clean them, keep them lubed, make sure they're not rusty, other than what we were checking before, that they spin, that there's no wobble, that they're attached and all. You want to make sure that they're clean, working well, and you want to test them with your shoes. If you're running clipless also, you'll want to make sure that the cleat that attaches into the pedal isn't overworn either, and that it's not loose. The last thing you want is for these nuts to be loose in such a way that when you go to clip out, there's too much play and you can't get clipped out. That has happened to me, where I actually had to take my shoe all the way off and then use my Leatherman to get the clip out, and then I had to tighten down those bolts. So when those start going loose, it can cause problems. So you really want to make sure that these are good and secure on your shoes as part of that pedal check if you're running clipless. Number 24, we're almost done, is your cassette. So your cassette are the gears at the back of your bike. You want to make sure that there is no issues with wear or breakage of teeth on the cassette. So you'll have to turn it and check them. You also want to make sure that there's not any play in the cassette, that you can't wobble the whole thing back and forth, or that it feels like you can slide it back and forth. Sliding it back and forth would indicate that you need to tighten down the lock nut on the cassette with the wheel off to make sure that it's good and tight on the wheel. And if there's some play moving forward and backward, it may be that the free hub body that's underneath this as part of the hub is causing an issue and is worn. One of the two. It could be also that you're missing a spacer, either to keep the spacing correctly, or again, that it's not tightened down correctly. So all of those things, if this was sloppy, it would indicate some need to either tighten, or if the teeth are worn or broken, it perhaps needs to be replaced. And last but not least, number 25 is your derailleur. On this bike, there's actually two. There's a rear derailleur and there's a front derailleur that is off camera. You want to make sure that, again, the derailleurs are in good repair. Some of the issues that you might see is when you look at the derailleur, sometimes the swing arm can look like it's bent. So it could be bent. That issue may either be on the derailleur itself or from the derailleur hanger where the derailleur attaches to the bike. These, on a lot of bikes, are made to fail before the derailleur fails. So if it gets smashed on the side, it's made to fail either to bend, be flexible, while saving and preserving the derailleur itself. So if it's broken, you just need to replace the derailleur hanger. If the derailleur hanger is just ever so slightly bent out of shape, normally bent in, it makes it so shifting is never going to be precise. And it will normally hyperextend that rear derailleur when it's in the largest ring. It could go past and derail the chain behind the teeth of the cassette and in between the cassette and the spokes, which can cause major issues. It can break spokes, it can break the chain, it can break the cassette. So making sure that this is set up correctly is important. Next, assuming everything is straight, you want to adjust the derailleur and check to make sure that it shifts through all the gears without issue and is smooth and correct. It shouldn't be making grinding sounds or having major issues. All of those things may indicate either a need to tension or reduce the tension on the cable for the bike That can be done on the barrel adjusters on the shifters, or that there is an issue with the alignment of the derailleur hanger, or the derailleur itself could be bent here and there. So there's different things that can be checked. Recommend your bike shop or a good mechanic friend to help check those. With the front derailleur, there's a few different things you want to check with. If it's a derailleur that attaches to the seat tube itself, it could be turned side to side. This bike actually, it mounts directly to the frame, and so alignment isn't an issue. But if it mounts to the tube, it can be turned side to side, which limits your ability to shift. So you want to look down on it, make sure that the derailleur cage that outlines the chain, that it lines up with the chain ring on your front crank arms. You want to make sure that also that it shifts through correctly, that the height here is set, that it's not running into the chain rings, and that when you release, that it releases the chain and moves it from chain ring to chain ring if you're running a 2x or a 3x. So I hope that was useful for all of you, that it gave you some ideas of the things that you really need to be looking over to make sure your bike is safe and ready for the season. You probably noticed this wasn't a tutorial on how to repair your bike to get it ready for the season, but the things that you should be checking. If you're competent and know how to fix these things, you can do that yourself, or you could go to Park Tools' YouTube channel. They have a lot of great tutorials on how to fix different things on the bike and get them ready for the season. Or you could take it to your local bike shop and have them look over and find and repair some of those things that you found in your bike check. So I hope you liked this. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, look for opportunities to give those old things new life. And I will see you on the next video. Ciao. That was a lot of talking. It was fun checking all the kids' bikes. There was a lot of little issues and little things that were easy to fix that I was happy to fix and help them out with. I actually had the kids hold the list themselves and tell me what was next on the list, and had them help me go through the bike and to check it over. For a lot of them, they didn't even know the names of some of the different parts of the bike. So it was a good chance to also teach them what parts there were on the bike and how to make sure that it was working correctly. It's good stuff.